Aha! Here are the paints I used for painting zombie Thanos. First, I covered the blue parts of the suit with Night Lord's blue. I'm using a thin layer consistency and I cover around 80% of the surface with multiple thin layers. I like to paint his suit to a dark blue mid-tone. I can achieve that by leaving the recess areas black, and I just move the brush over these areas once, so my darkest shadows will appear almost like black, but not exactly. If you are painting a dark red or green, but you want to make it high in contrast, you need to have some black or almost black layers there. If you want to have a higher value mid-tone, you can cover everything with a dark base tone, but since we can't go darker than black, we need to have that low value, so our main highlight colors will appear brighter next to them and have higher contrast and saturation in the end. After that, I continue to cover other parts of the mini, like the skin. So Thanos' skin is more of a lilac hue, but since this is not the living version, we can make it a little bit more pale. By the way, no living version of Thanos in the game. What the hell, Simon? Anyway, they skipped Hulkbuster too, but I guess there is a good chance there will be a second season for this game. I guess they're just waiting for the show to be released, which I'm sure is going to be just as good as any series Marvel done lately. So, as I said, we could go for a lilac color, but for this version, I want to make his skin more pale and desaturated. So in the previous step, we left some very dark, almost black shadows over the suit, but this time we don't need to do that, since we can cover everything with xereus purple as a base for our darkest shadows. We want to paint a high contrast skin as well, but contrast is relative and determined by the values. We can still have a high contrast skin without completely black shadows, depending how far we want to push the highlights. Apply 2 thin layers to have a nice and even coverage. On the gold parts of the suit, I cover everything with black red. Thin layer consistency again. It's a little bit thinner this time, and I covered the recessed shadows on the chest plate as well, since those areas are facing up. It wouldn't look very natural if they had black recessed shadows. I apply multiple layers to build up the opacity, and I only apply the next layer when everything is nice and dry, like Granny's armpit, okay? If I see you guys tagging me on Instagram with horrible texture buildup on your minis, because you can't wait for your layers to dry, Papa Labort is going to cry, and I will slap on your tiny hands. With a mix of black and daemonette hide, I highlight the rocks on the base. I want to keep this to a low value mid-tone, so I'm leaving a bigger portion of these meteors black. I'm overbrushing the paint to get the texture details stand out more. To overbrush, you just dip your brush into base layer consistency of paint and remove the excess on a paper towel, similar to how you would do it if you would dry brushing, but the brush is somewhat damp before you dip it into the paint. Once you remove the excess, you gently apply the paint over the surface, catching all the raised details, and since the brush is wet, you can do some stippling motion as well for the harder to reach areas. Be very gentle, you guys, okay? Like moving Granny from the bed to the wheelchair after her femoral neck fracture. And you don't need to apply it like you have Parkinson's, because paint will be all over these rocks. Okay, so just build up the layers nice and softly and gently, and wait for the layers to dry. We need to build up volumes nice and steady. I would like to create a drop shadow under the character, so I apply way less brush strokes under the character and behind it, so the highlight placement will be more consistent. Now we can start working on our skin highlights. The skin is very well detailed with all these necrotic blisters and large holes and gaps between the rotting muscle fibers. With my highlight placement, I usually cover the areas that are facing up, and I fill the recesses on those areas, so this new layer will become the recess shadow's value once we highlight it more in the further steps. It will create a nice gradient over the whole skin. On the more shadowy areas of the skin, I keep my dark recess shadows, and I highlight the fibers and blisters around them. When you are highlighting minis, you should always ask yourself if this angle that this arm has, for example, which parts should be highlighted. If it faces towards the light source, it should be highlighted with your first highlight, and if it looks down, add less volume to these areas, so you will have a nice foundation that you can work on, and if you follow these rules for the rest of the surfaces, your highlight placement should look consistent and believable. Of course, this can be more complex with multiple reflections of the armor and different light sources, but if you have no clue where to put these highlights, just try to follow this one simple rule. I like to paint the eyes and teeth when I have the base tone or one highlight over the face. Because if I make a mistake here, there are not much to be ruined, so it will be easier to fix. Like if I paint two big eyes or teeth, for example. Use a base layer consistency and soak your brush into the paint up to the ferrule. I know you guys are scared because, oh no, it will get into the ferrule of the brush and it will ruin my nice brush. Like, no, Papa Labor, so I'm so scared. Okay, calm down first. It will only ruin your brush if you let the paint dry, alright? That's a very important part. So if you have the right consistency, you have like half a minute to paint the eyes, then you rinse off your brush and go for the teeth or the other eye. It doesn't matter. Reverse the order, Papa Labors couldn't care less, but once you have your brush with the paint, shape it on your knuckle to have a nice tip, okay? If your tip is pointy like Granny's nipples and the paint flows nicely from the brush, but it's not too runny, then you have a good chance to paint some very nice eyes. Go in from the sides and turn the mini upside down to paint the side that is on the opposite side compared to your painting hand, okay? Papa Labors is left-handed, so I can easily paint the right eye, which is the left if we look at it from the front. But if you are right-handed, you'll have an easier time with the left eye, which is the right from the front. Can you guys follow? Or are you just squinting your eyes and slowly start to nod, but really you don't have a clue? Anyway, the side that is not on your painting hand side is easier to reach if you turn the mini upside down. After that, I sketch out an OSL effect with burnt red. It's going to be just a rough sketch, and you can see I'm angling the mini in a way that I can see how close I need to bring this color over the right leg to create a silhouette with this value. Let's imagine that this light source is coming from below the rock and bleeds over the lower side of the character. I'm sketching it on the infinity gauntlet too, but later I decided not to use this value on the gauntlet because, how do I put it simply? The infinity gauntlet is horrible. It has mud lines all over it, up to a point where you can't really remove them without scraping off half of the gems, and painting that thing was an awful experience. But hey, these are board game minis, so what can you do about it? Well, actually, I see more and more companies on Kickstarter selling the digital files to their minis when they are making a campaign. So I hope Simon would do that someday with their games as well. Anyway, Papa Labors was quite pissed, so I went and bought a GV model to come myself with some better quality plastic, and I don't even play Warhammer. Not like I played Marvel Zombies ever, because my game is not fully painted and I live by the you don't play with the grey codex, but I'm sure some of you can relate that after painting some board game minis, you need to paint something with, with edges that doesn't have more lines on them. Alright, back to the skin. I pushed the contrast on the skin with more cadian fleshtone in the mix. I'm catching all the raised parts of the skin and leaving the recessed shadows to the previous highlight mix to add more depth to the skin. I'm using thin layer consistency for this, and I build up my highlights with multiple layers. Since the skin is very textured with all these necrotic blisters, you can create some very easy blend with just thin layers and not requiring any glazing over these surfaces. The more textured the surface, the less blending you need, since the texture does most of the blending for the paint at this scale. If you have a similar mini, but a bust, for example, then it would be way more work to paint these details, but the less surface we have to paint, the faster we can do it.
The sound lingers, just a rhythm on demand. Soft and simple, sweet as syrup, that's what makes pop a band.
With pure cadian fleshtone, I reduce my highlight areas over the skin. I make the recessed shadows a little bit more muted on the face. Thanos has a very characteristic chin with all these grooves, but those are quite narrow, so I made them smaller by applying cadian flesh on both sides of these grooves, and I add less and less volume over the left side of the face, since that area has more shadows. I think cadian fleshtone works very well for this pale skin tone with purple base value, because it looks quite believable. This skin would look something like this if we would see a pale version in real life of that skin tone. On the rest of the skin, I just pick out some blisters and muscle fibers along the body that are facing up, so the highlights look more consistent.
Their cordal blocking out all cares and pains. Tiny slaps a beat like apples, good for heart and good for brains. Every touch, a whispered laughter hidden in the sweet refrains. With a chuckle and a chuckle, every slap's a gentle tune. In the living room, he whispers all his secrets to the moon.
With the skin nearly done, I can continue working on the blue parts of the suit. I mix some magic blue to my Night Lord's blue and reduce the main planes of light. I add more volume to the chest area, and as I go lower on the torso and legs, I apply less volume to keep the focal point around the chest and face. I'm using thin layers to build up these highlights, but I do go thinner with the consistency to make some smoother blends. It's very important to keep the ratios of my layers on the mini, so I don't want to get rid of those very dark shadow areas. Nowadays, I like to have bigger shadow areas on my zombie minis. For one, they are a time saver because the shadow areas need less highlight work, which can be nice. And two, they create a more dramatic feel to the mini in my opinion. With these highlights, we still need to follow my simple rule of highlight placement and checking the angle of the surface I'm painting. So the half of those tethered rags around the arms should be highlighted, as well as the left leg that is stepping a little bit more forward. With that leg, we need to watch out to keep that very dark blue value next to our burnt red OSL sketch, because we need a nice separation between the OSL light source and our natural light source. So keeping the darkest layer color of the subject, that is the blue pants in this case, could help with that.
Underneath the moonlit sky, where whispered dreams take flight. With a sigh, the night begins, softly playing violin.
After that, I continue the process with temple guard blue. This layer will push our values more. I almost entirely cover the previous layer of highlights over the chest and abs area. With thin layers, these highlights blend in like the sleeping pills in Granny's oatmeal, so you will have an easy time placing these highlights. This value will shift our blues to a bit more teal hue, but teal is just blue mixed with yellow, so it's a nice and saturated highlight tone, making the mini visually more appealing than just using colder, higher value blues. Those could work as well, but usually the more saturation you have, the visually it's more pleasing in my opinion. Since we have these almost black or entirely black shadows over the mini, it still reads as a cold color, but it will look good next to the gold parts once we paint those. For my last highlight, I mix a baharroth blue and the ice yellow. I'm using stippling to apply this highlight over the chest area, creating small dots inside my previous highlight layer and creating some blends that are as smooth as Granny's butt cheek. With this value, I'm reaching a very high contrast blue for the suit, and I'm quite happy with it. You don't need too much volume with this highlight. This is just the icing on the cake. It's the same with Granny's insulin. Okay? If you give her too much, she can go into a shock. Alright? Can be entertaining for a couple of minutes, but we don't want that. We just want to have a little visual tickle. You can see I painted some blues over the gold parts. Don't worry about those little mistakes. That's why we painted the suit first, because the gold is a layer upon the blue suit, so it's easier to reach and we less likely make mistakes on the way when we are going to paint the gold on the already painted blue suit. Less likely is not 0%, so watch out in the next part, because if you make a mistake, I will slap on your tiny hand. Okay, now it's time to paint the gold armor. First I use a mixture of black red and gold brown. I'm painting the metal in a non-metallic way, which means we are using regular acrylics instead of a metallic paint. This is a bit more advanced technique, but if you could follow the steps up to this point, you will have no problem following this part either. First, we need to sketch out our volumes. With gold, we have a pretty big room to play with regarding the ratios of the color, because if you have a bigger brown layers and less ochre, it would still read as gold, if you have enough contrast by the end of your process. Now the surface of the armor is a little bit textured as it's falling apart on the body. We will care about those details by the end of our process, but for now, just focus on adding more volume to the chest and the helmet area. I follow the same highlight placement with the gold parts, like with the blue suit, so I add less and less volume over the lower half of the mini. Watch out for our burnt red parts over the boots to keep them to keep the black red layer between the burnt red and the gold brown to keep the separation of the two light sources visible, and you line it up with the blue parts of the leg. Okay, so I'm using thin layers, and you can create some thin lines around the main highlight areas to add some texture. Now on the gauntlets, at this step I left some bigger shadow areas, but later I went back to add more volume because the gauntlet is a very important part of Thanos, so I want to bring some more attention to it, despite it's not a very nicely casted one. The tricky part is to keep the focus on the good parts of it, and spoiler alert, there ain't many. So try to enhance the cylinder shape on the forearm and try to figure out the knuckles and the finger joints for yourself, because those are a mess. It brings up an interesting thought, because you might think, well, Papala, why bother with NMM if the cast is bad? With NMM, we can leave the worst parts darker and keep our highlights on the better areas, but if we cover it with metallic gold paint, we would raise the level of detail to the same level everywhere, so I guess using NMM is for the better here. On the back of the mini, I leave bigger shadow areas and make sure that I always wait for my layers to dry before applying the next one. You can create some quick blends using layering, but right now I'm just catching all these highlights with a base layer consistency. Once you sketch the major volumes, it's time to blend. Reduce your paint to a thin consistency and move your brush from the black red to the burnt red layer. This way, you will build up the opacity in your already opaque areas and smooth out the transitions way more. If you need to, go back and forth with a thin consistency of black red and gold brown and black red mixture, but when you're using the black red, make sure you use an opposite brush motion. So you start your brush stroke in the gold brown area and end it in the black red layer. Keep repeating this until you are happy with your result. It's very important that you use the right consistency, so if your blends are starting to become more harsh and not smooth like Granny's butt cheek, try to thin your paint down more. Reduce your highlight areas with gold brown. NMM has a lot of reflections over the surface, so you can create multiple highlights over the gauntlet and helmet, but on the more flat areas, like the chest, we are working on a more bigger gradient. Since the chest armor contains multiple layers of metal, we can make some edge highlights along the armor panels to add more detail. On the fingers, you can create some secondary reflections along the darkest shadows to make them more metallic looking, and the same goes for the rest of the gauntlet. Now, if you want to, you can repeat the same blending step once you are happy with the gold brown highlights, but this time you will need to start your brushstroke in the gold brown, black red layer and end it in the pure gold brown parts. NMM is one of those things that the more time you spend on it, the better it will look. You can make the blend smoother or revise some of the highlights. You will always find some ways to improve it, so it's up to you how much time you want to sink in this part.
A stolen moment, sweet this is, underneath the moonlit sky, where whispered dreams take flight. With a sigh, the night begins, softly playing violins, your hand in mine, a gentle sway, as stars above come out.
Now let's add some warmth to our gold with yellow ochre. I start to add more and more edge highlights over the armor panels to add more detail, and it's a nice little trick to do on minis, because if you have highlights over some narrow shape like the belt or the binding on the suit, you can get away with these details instead of making the nicest blends and spend too much time on one part. If you like to have more saturation over these parts, you can even glaze some yellow over them. But this time I like this level of saturation, and you can see that this ochre is looking very nice next to the dark blue suit, making it stand out way more than it previously did.
That softly croons as we twirl to silent tunes. Let the world around us sleep. We'll cherish secrets that we keep.
After that, I paint the maximum highlights of the gold armor with ice yellow. I place these highlights over the chest inside my yellow ochre areas. This makes the gold shiny and more metal looking. When I place the highlights on the chest, I line them up like one continuous shape, because the chest armor is one flat sheet of metal divided into panels. I push the contrast on the gauntlet, placing my highlights over the ring bindings of the gems. Previously, I covered the gems with black for the sake of cleanliness, so now I can see which part of the gauntlet is the gem and which part is the mold line around it. I put an 11 o'clock highlight on these rings, and I paint some secondary reflections over the fingers as well. I think the gauntlet is quite an important part of the character, so we can bring more focus to it by adding a little bit more volume. On the back, I create a scratch-like pattern for this value. You need to shape your brush's tip to make it pointy, like Granny's nipples, like I mentioned before, and do a random zigzag pattern over the surface. On the waist, I line up these highlights with the blue suit and follow this pattern over the back of the boot as well. I make the OSL effect more saturated over the character's side and the rocks with xereus and scarlet. I paint along the pattern of the larger rocks on the bottom, but it's very important to do that inside the previous burnt red layer. This way our light source will be more defined, and we can tell that light is coming from below the character. On the side of the leg, I try to pick out every little detail that is facing down towards the ground, and end this red area around the waist.
While he's tapping tiny fingers, we're waltzing in the dew.
I go back to the base and I add more volume to the rocks with warpfiend gray. This is a grayish purple color that I really like. Now I want to bring out the texture more on these rocks, so I'm just picking out all the raised parts in front of the character mostly, because I want to keep that strong drop shadow below him. It's a fun process because it's quite easy, and if you keep the recessed shadows, the rocks will look more and more detailed throughout the process.
The wind outside is howling, and the rain taps on the panes. Papa's hands keep up their cordle, blocking out all cares and pains. Tiny slaps a beat like apples, good for heart and good for brains. Every touch.
I add some ice yellow to the gray and reduce my highlight areas inside my previous layer. I'm not using any glazes or finer stippling to smooth out these blends. I want to see the texture of these rocks, as I mentioned before. The more texture you have on your mini, the less blending you will need. In this case, I'm fine with zero blending, so it looks more rough, which is very fitting for some cold, rocky pedestal for this character. Now I do my usual runs for the zombie characters of the game and mute back the whiteness of the teeth with some very thin glaze of black red. The consistency is very diluted and it stains the teeth very nicely with only 2 layers. If you want to, you can use any wash of your choice, the result will be quite similar. Try to move the glaze into the recesses, but make sure you go over the whole denture. If it gets a little splotchy, that's perfectly fine because it will give some variety to the stains. Next, we will use some fluorescent orange. The paint consistency should be quite thin, so you will need a few layers around and over the eyes. The key here is to avoid letting the paint pool on the eyeball itself, instead spread it carefully around the eye socket. This approach will create a simple yet striking glow effect over the eyes, which I found really effective. The result is that the eyes take on a vibrant glowing color that contrasts beautifully with pale lifeless skin, drawing more focus to the face as a whole. Granny gets the same glow to her eyes when you buy her a pack of her favorite cigarettes. The armor is a little bit too clean for the zombie version, and I usually avoid this wear and tear approach part for the zombie heroes, but I want to make them look more rough looking in the future for other heroes as well, so I paint these cracks over the armor. At this stage they will look like stains because they don't have any depth, but we will add some in the next step. Try to make them as random as possible because we want to create some battle damage over these armor panels. If you fancy, you can use a sponge to do this. I'm not super familiar with that technique, so I rather use my brush. I also recess shade some of the shadow areas with this value as well, and I'm using a thinner consistency so the paint could flow nice and easily from my brush. With ice yellow, I'm going to create an edge highlight for these holes that I painted on the armor, so it will have some depth as light is catching the lower half of these cracks. As I went along the lower side, I tried to make my lines somewhat straight so it would look believable that the armor cracked in certain places. I also do some final edge highlights over the helm and create these random scratches all over the armor to add a little bit more detail to the surface. I found it easier to do that with a thinner consistency.
Granny Labor's cheeky charm won't ever die. Oh, those smooth cheeks like a lullaby, soft as a whisper, bright as the sky. In every laugh and in every sigh, Granny Labor's cheeky charm won't ever die.
So that's it for Zombie Thanos, guys. I made a PDF for the gems in the Infinity Gauntlet. If you want to paint the same way as I did, you can find a link to that guide in the description. A huge thanks to my patrons for supporting these kinds of videos. If you like to access to my PDF guides for other characters of the game, or maybe decide and vote which hero or villain you'd like to see painted next, consider joining my Patreon page. And as always, thanks for the ones who are slapping on tiny hands. Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Glitchy McCrash, Penoman45, Michael Kerr, Adam Holt. I hope your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.